So welcome. Thank you for coming today on this first Sunday in August. We're starting our series today on the three faces of God. I'm glad to see you here, and welcome also to our online audience. We are always glad when you can join us. So we've had some prayers today about the events in El Paso and in Dayton, and I know that in pulpits all over the country, what's happening today is the same thing that was happening in my heart, is ministers and imams and rabbis and spiritual leaders, whomever, are looking at the pages they wrote and they're thinking, what do I want to talk about today? What is it in the face of events that are happening yesterday and this morning? What is it we need to talk about? It's always a challenge because something like this happens and then folks are kind of called on to try to make sense of it, to give spiritual guidance about it. And sometimes that's a task that is bigger than we are. But what this series is about and what I want to talk today and what these events made me think of is to invite us all to think about how God shows up. How God shows up in our lives and in our world. Because I think this is an important thing to consider, because what these events teach me is that God shows up only when we do. That there's no other hands, no other voice, no other feet to the presence of the divine in our world other than us being it and saying it and doing it. When we realize our oneness with each other, our profound connection with each other, then there's no way that we can pick up a gun or pick up a knife or commit violence against God, the face of God, that is that person looking back at us. Because that's what that person is. The face of God is always the face of the person looking back at us. And when we realize our profound connection with each other and the fact that we are one, there is no other. The notion of the other just dissolves. And that's where this violence comes from. That's where this hatred and divisiveness comes from, is when people can take others, whether they're immigrants or Muslims or African Americans or transgender, whatever the other person is, and dehumanize them and minimize them and take away from them their humanity, take away from them the fact that they are God just like you are. That's when we can do things like this. And that is one of the roles, one of the purposes of communities like this, not only to change our own hearts, because the Dalai Lama says a change of heart begins with a change of mind, but it's to take these principles and go out and be them, go out and talk about them, and live such a life that we cannot even begin to feel violence toward another or look at the face of God across the room from us and think that it is the other. It is a profound transformation. It's not just somebody saying you should be nice to each other, but it's such an internal change that we cannot but be the oneness that we are sent to be. So, in a sense, this series is a good one to start with, because we're talking about the ways that God shows up in the world. We're talking about the ways that we express the divine in this world. And it's only when little groups like us and bigger groups who are having this same conversation can go out and do that and be that, will this change happen. Will we be able to change our hearts and change the hearts of those around us? It's not something we do in a day, and it's maybe not something we individually can do. Remember last week I talked about the Stoics. What's the first rule of being a Stoic? You focus on what you can do, not on what you can't control. I can't stand up here and make this world a happy, peaceful place, but I can do my bit. And we can all go out and do our bit. And shame on us if we don't do our bit, because it's not everything. We just do what we can. And acting together, we make that difference. step by step, and heart by heart. So today what I want to talk about is I want to kick off, and I invite you to keep thinking about that. How does God show up in your life? How do you manifest God in relationship with others? How do you spread that energy of love and oneness in every choice you make and in every interaction you have? It's not easy. It takes daily practice and it takes daily heart commitment. But that, I think, is what we are here to do. And we can do it because we have control over our own sphere and over our own actions and over our own words. So what I want to talk today about is a little bit about the notion of the three faces of God. And as we go through this series, what I want to do is invite you to think about how you conceptualize the divine, how the divine shows up for you, how you welcome that energy of the divine into the circle of your life, because we can expand that and we can open it. So St. Thomas Aquinas was one of the most influential theologians and philosophers of the Western Christian Church. I'm sure we've all heard of St. Thomas Aquinas. His commentaries on Aristotle, his treatises on the Psalms, his major work Summa Theologica, which he never finished, have had lasting effect on the development of Western thought. However, at one point in his life, and I didn't know this until I started researching this, at one point in his life he was willing to give it all up. And toward the end of his life, he just said enough is enough. He was going to throw it all away. Joseph Campbell tells us that he indeed asked one of his followers just to burn all his books. That would have been a huge loss, but that's what he said, burn all my books. And the reason was because of a personal experience of God, a personal transformative experience that convinced him that all he had written was meaningless compared to what he had just seen. This is Thomas Aquinas. Everything he had written was meaningless. So in 1273, as he was celebrating the feast of St. Nicholas, he was celebrating Mass, when he had an experience, a revelation that so affected him that he just stopped writing. That's why Summa Theologica was unfinished by him. When asked what had happened, he said, "The end of my labors has come. All that I have written appears to be as so much straw after the things that have been revealed to me." Think about that. Just blam, Thomas Aquinas stops writing. A lifetime of thought and labor, overwhelmed and to him made completely meaningless by that one revelation, that one experience of God. So how do we even begin to think about that? How do we, who are foreign to that experience, even begin to understand what happened to him? How can we begin to try to have ourselves such a transformative experience? What language can we use, and where do we look? These are the questions that we're going to explore during this series. So throughout the millennia, men and women have yearned for ways to experience the divine and then go back and tell others what happened to them, because that's two different things. What do they say about the ineffable? You can't articulate it. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. So how do you have an experience like that and then go out and talk about it and tell others that they can have it too? Think of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on that cave on Mount Hira, having this experience of the angel Gabriel appearing to him and stumbling out of the cave in absolute panic and running home thinking that he was crazy. Or think about Saul on his horse on the road to Damascus, out on his merry way to persecute Christians. Wham! Jesus appears to him and says, "Saul, why do you do this to me?" And there he is, just lying on his back in the dirt, looking up, saying, "What happened?" That would change the rest of his life. Or think of the warrior Arjuna on the field of Kurukshetra as he asked Lord Krishna to just reveal himself, and he does, with 1,000 faces shining like the sun and thousands of arms and gold and light and splendor, and Arjuna just falls to his knees and can't even face the majesty of what he is experiencing. So can we touch and experience the divine in our own lives? I will tell you, I have never had any one of those experiences, but we can. Not necessarily those, but we can have our own direct and personal and transformative experience of God. And part of our awakening toward that is widening our awareness, just our thinking of how God might appear in our lives. So we today are in a position really that humanity has never been in. Why? Because of our technology, because of our closeness. In centuries past, what would have happened? We would have been born and lived and died among people who looked like us, lived like us, worshiped like us, practiced the same religion. Barriers of time and geography and communication prevented us from being exposed to other cultures, other faith traditions, and the sheer variety around the globe, the many other faces of the divine experienced by other cultures and other people. The world was just a more culturally separated place. You just never saw these other folks. If your parents followed a particular religion, chances are your neighbors did, and chances are that you did too. Okay, so what do we have now? The world is intimate, the world is immediate. If you have access to the internet, you are a global citizen, and you are a student of all faith traditions. The walls of geography and nationality and culture are just down. You are no longer limited to the aspects of God, the notion of God, the understanding of God that your parents knew. Our worlds are opened up, and we are free to draw from every other faith tradition to create our own path. We can use the practices of other faith traditions to dig our own spiritual journey deeper, and there are many who do that. I think of the Catholic fathers who went to India in the 16th century to convert the supposed heathen. What did they do? They stayed. And they learned from those contemplative practices to deepen their own journey. They didn't become Hindus, but they became much deeper Christians. They developed a contemplative practice, which they brought back to the West, and it has changed all of us. They applied the practices they learned from an entirely different tradition to deepen their own spiritual walk. Or we can do what a lot of folks here at One will do. We craft our own path using the tools from this and the tools from that, and we just create our own journey when we have walked away from more traditional houses of worship. But just considering that the divine can be experienced and met and appreciated in multiple ways is an opportunity, a precious chance that we have that so many have not had. Okay, so what do I mean by the faces of God? Let's take a look. So many of you may be familiar with the work of Ken Wilber. He is a brilliant philosopher, theologian. If any of you have read Ken Wilber, I will tell you it is heavy sledding. You're not just going to take Ken Wilber like on a beach, you know, so well, I did, and boy was that a mistake, but it is not what we call chick lit, okay? It is heavy sledding. But he is a pioneer in the field of what they call integral spirituality. And he articulated the concept of what he calls the three faces of God. And what is that? He writes that the world's enduring faith traditions see God in three basic ways: first, second, and third person. I, you, and it. Just think about that. It's a useful way to think about it. God as me, God in relationship, and God as all there is. Three faces, three ways to consider the divine. First, and this is familiar to us, we experience God as me, in us. We do that here all the time. This is a face we're familiar with and we're comfortable with. We are expressions of the divine, right? God is inside, I am a manifestation of God. This is the first face of God, God as me. Here we experience the great I am, the God within, where we experience God in and as our very essence. Especially those of us who come from New Thought, this is very familiar. This is the face that Ken Wilber calls the singular to which the plural is unknown. And he also calls it open awareness behind all expression. Think about that. That's an interesting image. The face of God in which we know that we are the divine expressing on earth, the God within, what we might call the Christ consciousness, the Buddha nature, the Atman, our spark of divinity within. So we can have amazingly transformative insights when we rest in this face. We can have peak experiences, what they call satori or kensho, true insights. How do we get these? Many get them through meditation, through contemplative practice. Others can get them through drumming or chanting or dancing. Whatever your practice is, this is how we connect with Source. We enter into the vast, unlimited pool of consciousness that theologian Paul Tillich labeled simply the ground of being, the universal truth underneath what we know as ego, underneath what we know as personality. As Wilber puts it, our ego tells us that we are matter. I am matter. I am in this room. I am in this building. This building is in the universe. But we are not mere matter when we rest in this first phase. We are what he calls consciousness as such, of which matter is merely the outer skin. If we can enter into that space, if we can rest in a place that he calls witness, a vast, open, empty consciousness. Okay, one thing I'm going to say as I go through this is you will notice behind me there is not a whiteboard. This is not a place for wiring diagrams. We love to have things so neat. I love to have things so neat. This is a place where we have to enter into the mystery and just let it sink in. I read this stuff and sometimes it makes no sense. It may make no sense until the next day. It's not the sort of paradigm we can understand on simply the cognitive level. So just sit in it and just consider these thoughts as we go through. He wrote, "It becomes obvious that I am not in the body. The body is in me. I am not in this house. The house is in me. I am not in the universe. The universe is in me. All of them are arising in the vast, open, empty, pure, luminous space of primordial consciousness. Right now and forever right now. Therefore, be consciousness." This is first person, an awakening to pure consciousness and expansive awareness. This might be an awareness that we can rest in for a few minutes. It might be an awareness we have in a flash. I don't know if any of you have ever had it, just that knowing, that connection with that deep primordial consciousness. The fact that I can be me, but that the universe can also be in me. This is the first phase, and it is challenging. But we can't stay there, because even if we have such an experience, if we limit ourselves to this first phase only, without the experience of the second or the third, what are we missing? Well, we are missing arrogance. We may become self-centered. You are the divine after all. What else needs to be done? The universe is in me. It's all here. I don't need to get up off my butt and do anything, because I can just sit here and be the universe. Everything's in perfect order. Wilber calls this boomeritis. He says we bow to nothing. We are humble, not at all. We are, as he calls it, the apex of the pinnacle. Okay, we can't rest there. Our first phase spirituality grows only when it is informed and it is deepened by the other two views. So the second phase, let's talk about that for a second. This is the aspect that many of us knew from childhood. This is the God that is other. This is the God in relationship. So I remember many years ago, my wife and I, we were putting one of our kids in a private school. And I asked the headmaster, whoever was talking, about whether they had a religious component. And he said, well, not really. We teach the kids that there is a God and it's not them. So that's the second phase. There is a God and it's not you. This may be the God that we were taught judges us and watches us and finds us worthy or wanting. This is an anthropomorphic God that looks like us and in many stories behaved like us in our not so fine moments. Petty, cruel, nasty, arrogant, jealous. This may be the God that many of us who came from New Thought may have rejected as you sat in your church or your synagogue or your whatever and you thought, this is just not right. I cannot worship a God who behaves like that, who speaks like that, who acts like that. But that's not the whole story. There's a healthier face, there's a more loving, relational face. We also have experiences of a God who is loving and intimate and supportive. Unity co-founder Myrtle Fillmore wrote, "Sometimes I have written a letter to God when I have wanted to be sure that something would have divine consideration and attention." It's a God that we can rest in. Throughout the Christian scriptures, God is called the Lamb, the King, Light, the Good Shepherd, the Comforter, the Almighty and Eternal, the Alpha and the Omega, and many other names. These are all different aspects of the relationship we can have with this image of the deity as the other. The Quran gives us 99 different names for Allah, including the holy, the peaceful, the faithful, the guardian over his servants, the shelter of the orphan, the friend of the bereaved, the consoler of the afflicted, the compassionate, the merciful, the forgiving, whose love for man is more tender than that of the mother bird for her young. And it goes on. These names each reflect different aspects of the divine in relationship with us. And we can find support in them. We can gain strength from them. This is not a different God than the supreme energy that created the universe and just continues to pour out light and love and creativity and generativity at every moment. It's just a different way of imaging it. And that is one thing we do. If we take as a given that we cannot articulate God, that we cannot understand the ineffable, what we are left with is coming up with different ways to imagine that energy and different ways that we can be and relate to that energy that help us approach that truth in order that we can live lives of kindness and compassion and love and be that spark on the world. This is the face of God. This relational face is the face to which you turn, with which you can be in relationship when that is the language your heart needs you to speak. Sometimes if we have trauma in our lives, if we have despair or trouble, sometimes it may not be enough for us just as human beings to sit and realize that we are divine. We want to reach out. We want to reach out and be healed in our human selves. We want to say, I am not strong. I cannot do this. And there is an aspect of the divine that helps there. When we feel pain, we turn for help. In times when we are fearful or lonely, we surrender to knowing that we are in the presence of a power beyond ourselves. We can take our human, pained, troubled faces and turn toward this energy that is good, loving, and strengthening. I know that there are so many people who are doing that today, who are wondering why the events happened in El Paso and Dayton and other people who died of gun violence around the country that we don't even hear about. They may be looking at this relational aspect for strength, for comfort, for meaning, for something to tell them how they take that next step, how they continue going in a world that is so radically changed. In this relational aspect, we know that we are not carrying it all ourselves, and we can surrender some of the burdens that we carry. Seeing spirit in relationship gives us a means to grow that no other aspect has. Our challenge is to let this our understanding of this relational face mature. Why? Because any relationship matures. When you get married, you have a certain relationship, or enter into a relationship, you have a certain understanding of that person. 30 years later, it's going to be different. The relationship will have deepened. It will have matured. Our challenge in this relational aspect with the divine is to let it mature as well. In her book, Leaving Church, Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor laments the fact that so many in the Episcopal tradition promptly leave after the rite of confirmation. Rite of confirmation in the Episcopal Church is the point at which you pass from childhood to adulthood. You are 12, okay? And so what do most or many Episcopals, this one included, do the minute they hit the age of 12 and they have this rite of confirmation? They stop going, because now we're adults and I can make that decision myself. So at the age of 12, here I was, an Episcopal adult, and I just stopped going. What does that mean? It means that my understanding of spirituality, my understanding of my relationship with the divine froze at the age of 12. I was not a very mature 12. And neither, I am guessing, are a lot of people. So what does that mean? It means that they leave these houses of worship, they leave these traditional religious influences with the understanding of a child. And some of us, me included, spend many years kind of walking our way back. When we are young, this relational face starts out as a magical or a mythical God, right? The man on the cloud. The man who judges or rewards, he makes our football team win, he makes our candidate win, he makes me feel better when I am sick. He punishes our enemies or he gets us that raise. That's a magic, mythic God. Many have remained stuck in that relationship. It's the first phase. When we rejected this Santa Claus view of God, we rejected God in relationship entirely. And our spirituality is poorer because we did. So what about Santa Claus, this Santa Claus view of God? Santa Claus just gives to us. We don't give back. There's no real relationship. We just receive. Remaining in relationship with the divine as we grow opens our hearts to deeper aspects of spirit acting in relationship to us. We are supported in adversity. We're healed when we're in pain. We're loved when we are lonely. We also learn, and this is the maturing part, that God in relationship to us extends into us in relationship with others as conduits for God's love in the world. The compassion and love that we receive as we mature, we in turn give to those around us. We experience that God is found in relationship with others. This is what Martin Buber called the I-thou. The I-thou. God is found in the space between us. God extends to the space and is found in the relationship that grows to encompass all others we meet. This is why, when we mature in this relational phase, when we realize that God in relationship with us enriches us in relationship with others, this is when we can no longer see those different from us as others. This is when we realize that we are nothing but a continuing conduit for the flow of love that God gives to us. This is what Richard Rohr calls the circle dance of God. We receive, we give, we receive. As he said, God is not the dancer, but the dance itself. This is God in relationship. Meeting God in relationship leads into a deeper experience of the first phase, the God within. Why? Because in the second phase, we learn what? We learn humility, we learn grace, we learn gratitude. We see that we are of God, but we're not all of it. We are part of it, and we have our part to play, and we act as the channel of that love which we so constantly receive. That is the second phase. What Wilber teaches us is that a mature spirituality is when we are able to embrace the notion of God in all three phases. When we can be in relationship, we can know God as us, and we can also know God as all there is. And that's the third phase. We experience God in all creation. This is God as all there is. We're also very familiar with this in New Thought churches. This is also prominent in Eastern philosophy. We look at a sunset, a tree, a newborn baby, a range of mountains. We witness the compassion of strangers or simple acts of kindness, and we are just overwhelmed with the notion that there is God at work in this, in this, in this, in everything. Ken Wilber calls this phase the great perfection of existence itself unfolding. This is creation. This is love. This is generativity continuing to unfold. This is knowing that God is what is called the great web of life, and we are a part of it. We are a thread of it. This is also not a complete experience of God. Why? Because when we rest in the third phase, what are we doing? We're marveling at creation. We're thinking that is wonderful, but we're not all that involved. We're just looking at it. We're appreciating it. We're saying, wow, that's great. This is wonderful. Here's a wonderful sunset. Not much is asked of us. So this is where we get back to the first and the second phase. They get us up moving. They get us being the divine. They get us being in relationship with others. They give us those peak experiences when we realize that we can connect with the divine within. So no major faith tradition incorporates all three of these phases, but each of them emphasizes. You're going to have the Abrahamic faiths. What do they emphasize? Pretty much the second phase, the relational phase, right? In Judaism and Christianity and Islam, you're going to be told that God is out there. Our job is to worship God. We are certainly not God. Then you can get into some of the Eastern faith traditions, and they go for more of the third face, which is that God is everything. And our awakening occurs when we can join in and become that essence of everything. So this is a little confusing. I'm sure you're going to go walk out of here and say, what the heck was she talking about? But the takeaway from today is just to consider how you consider God appears in your life. Is the divine for you more of a second face kind of relationship? And sometimes it is. But the invitation is to just consider how we might expand our spirituality by bringing in that first face and that third face. The greater challenge for a lot of us who have left traditional houses of worship is to find legitimacy in the second face, because that introduces a duality we say we don't want, right? Because we're all about everything being one. And that duality is something we think is artificial. But our challenge is to kind of move past that and realize we are creating a false duality when we do that. It is just a way of thinking of how to engage with spirit. It does not mean that God is a man up in a cloud. It means that it gives us another way to engage, to approach when we need that way, when we are looking for that way. So let me close with a useful way to think about these three faces. This is from Reverend Paul Smith, who's out in Kansas City. It's a good place just to think about. He crystallizes it. The third face is God, in which we live and move and have our being. The second face is you are always with us. The first face is the God within. We are the light of the world. And the challenge of a spiritual path is to be open to all three, and to understand that the totality of the divine is found in all three. The Bhagavad Gita teaches, howsoever people try to worship me, so do I welcome them. By whatever path they travel, it leads to me at last. However we conceptualize, it leads to the divine at last. So let's think about that this week as we go out meeting God in others, thinking about how we manifest the divine in our own lives. And let's go out and just, in this week, which is going to be a week of healing, let's just make a point to be peace, to watch our words and our actions and our judgments, and always try to see the face of God in every face before us, whether it looks like us or not. So let's take these thoughts into meditation.